Great. So thank you. I'm going to do very brief introductions. The full bios are available with the registration information and on our website, so we won't waste a lot of time. We'll get right to the meat of what we're trying to talk about today. So I'm Jenn Shore. I'm the Executive Director of Focus for Health, and we are here today because the Focus for Health founder, Barry Siegel, was outraged by what he was finding out about the prevalence of sexual abuse in institutions. He saw the movie Spotlight, and he couldn't believe that institutions were allowing abuse to continue and thereby increasing the number of victims by their failure to act appropriately. In my journey as executive director, I tried to educate myself more about institutional sex abuse. And I came across most of the women here on the panel today as I was doing research, and I read about their organizations and the things that they were doing. So I want to thank everyone for taking the time to not just be a Focus for Health grantee, but to giving your expertise today to all of our participants. That being said, it is going to be a difficult conversation. We're not going to get too much in the weeds of specific things, but it is about sexual abuse of children, adults, gender-based violence, and all of those things that unfortunately our failure to talk about increase the prevalence of them occurring. So thank everybody for listening in today and taking the time to educate themselves about that. So we'll be looking at sexual abuse in youth-serving organizations, in the military. When we think about institutions, it's not just physical places, but they're constructs, so marriage, families, and we have representatives who will be talking about all of those things. One of the things that I like to think about when I think about individual sexual abuse versus institutional sex abuse is many people who are the victim of an individual crime understand the institutional issues when they try to seek justice for that crime. That's when you really find out all of the things that are stacked against victims in their pursuit for getting justice. And everybody else mute their phones. So with that, I'm going to start with Shira Berkovits. One of the things that I was astonished by when I started educating myself about this is there was one man who was quoted. He was a former prosecutor who started an organization very similar to yours. I think you're friendly with them and you put us in touch with them. He said when he was moving forward with cases, trying to get justice for victims, when it was a situation where it was in an institution, a religious group, a youth serving organization, what he found is that people would come out in support of the perpetrators, not the victims, as we would assume. Why do you think that that is occurring? That when an allegation is made in an institution, why do you think the inclination is to support the perpetrator more than the victim?
There are a few reasons. One has to do with what we think of or who we imagine when we think of a perpetrator. It's easy to have an image of some bad guy out there, a stranger, but that's not usually what a person looks like. When we have a case that we know in our communities, it's often a person we care about, we love, maybe somebody who's done much good. And the good is true. It's actually happened. And so everybody sees this good. It's public evidence, or maybe they even have personal interactions. Maybe this person is a leader. They've done the most good, or they're celebrated for their loving acts of kindness. And then there's all this information that's coming out that you really can't reconcile with that other information. And so there's a natural tendency for all people, it's cognitive dissonance, to say something here has to be untrue. So therefore, I'm going to reject this new information. Now imagine if the person you're hearing this about is also a faith leader, and this person represents what you believe as religion, or represents a system, maybe even represents God. Well, now this just takes on a whole other level. And so it becomes very hard to shift or to even hold multiple truths. And the other thing I'd say is that institutions are beloved, and maybe an entire community has invested for generations into an institution that has done much good. And so when somebody comes forward with an accusation against somebody in the institution, we tend to think of it as a binary of a victim versus the institution, instead of understanding that actually both the institution can stand with the victim, and it doesn't have to undermine all of the work that the institution has done, if they can find it within themselves to very courageously accept responsibility where they've done wrong and offer support where they need to.
Great. Thanks, Shira. I appreciate that. And it is such a complex issue. And I think we always think of a good guy and a bad guy, and there's so much subtlety and there's so much other factors at play and a lot of dynamics. I'm going to jump over to Deshauna Barber, who is the executive director of the Service Women's Action Network. We read a statistic recently that 25 to 30% of women and 10 to 20% in the military, of men in the military, had experienced some type of sexual abuse. So my question is, why? Why is this occurring, and why do you feel, in your role as an expert in this, that the military is struggling to do something about this effectively?
You know, that's $1 million question. I'm not 100% sure why sexual abuse is so prevalent within the military. I do know that when it comes to culture and when it comes to toxic leadership that has a level of acceptance for certain types of behaviors, it's very easy for inappropriate things to happen and for there not to be the right resources in place to be able to break up those predators. And I find that sometimes when it comes to uniformed positions or uniformed organizations, that there is a lot of misogyny, and there is a lot of moments where, especially with women, where it's a male dominated industry where you're going to have sexual harassment and sexual assault. I think the reason why the statistic is so high is because the military has not done a very good job at finding ways to prevent sexual assault. Oftentimes they're more of a reactive organization and the damage has already been done. So the organization lacking the right parameters to be able to create prevention methods. And I think one of the bigger prevention methods that's necessary for the military is really, 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 really in-depth psychological evaluations of the people that they bring into the organization. That's one thing. The second thing would be having a zero tolerance policy. Oftentimes, a lot of those that commit these crimes are repeat offenders. They are people that once they've assaulted someone, they move to another unit and they assault someone else. And they move to another unit and they assault someone else. There's no real true zero tolerance factor that's put into place where as soon as this happens, you're kicked out of the military. The criminal justice system within the military is kind of an iron sealed box. And oftentimes there is a lack of a real method to be able to put people out for these sort of crimes because of the level of investigation that has to come through. And there's just a lot of these ins and outs. And I don't think that the military has done a very good job of being able to track predatory behavior within their leadership. So it's a few things. But I think the main thing is the lack of prevention, the psychological evaluations that need to be done. And when making sure that when a person does commit their crime the first time, they don't get a second opportunity to do so.
Thanks, Deshauna. I appreciate that. And we'll talk more about that. One of the things that I do want to throw in, and then I'll go to somebody else, but I do want to say one of the things that was the most alarming about the statistics for the military, and it kind of speaks to what you're saying, is the repercussions to people who come forward. And we'll talk about that at the end, but a lot of what is occurring is when victims come forward, I think there was a statistic about the number of those individuals that end up with less than honorable discharges. Can you speak to that at all?
Yes, retaliation is very, very, very normal within a unit. So you have this sort of like family atmosphere type bond, taking care of your battle buddy. So when you're coming through and you're saying that this person did this, is very similar to what was previously stated when you're saying, well, no, that's one of our best soldiers. He couldn't have did that, or she couldn't have did that, whatever the case may be. And there is this lack of acceptance because you're supposed to look to your left and to your right for support, for camaraderie. So it is an organization that has a lot of issues with sexism. So oftentimes, especially when a woman comes forward, you're dealing with the fact that there's already probably sexist behavior going on in discrimination as is with their position. And now they're coming in and saying, oh, well, this man did this. So that creates this very retaliatory type environment. And oftentimes instead of choosing, you have to choose a side. So you're going to choose the side of the one that's less conflicting with everyone else's, with everyone else's opinion or behavior. So if it's a male dominated unit, we don't want to upset the males. So let's just, kick her out the military, show that we're all for hua, military side-by-side behavior. And it's definitely toxic leadership. But you also have a lot of those higher level ranking individuals that come from the pre-integration of women into combat arms military. So they're not used to women being around either. So they're also a lot of the older generations who's now in higher up leadership positions. They're still walking in with this mentality that women are not equal. Therefore, then we're not going to treat you equal, nor are we going to hold people that have wronged you accountable. So it's a few things, but yeah.
Deshauna, thank you. You set me up perfectly for the next question. So it was like we planned it. Thank you. So we talk about those kind of ingrained systems and some of kind of those old time sexist ideologies. And I'm going to jump to Allison. Allison is with Partnership for Change, and you're doing a lot of work around domestic violence, interpersonal violence. And, I was reading the numbers, as many as 1 in 4 women on average experience some incident of domestic violence. And that has been kind of a universal truth for as long as they've been doing surveys. That's existed for 100 years. So it's one of those things where we're kind of slow to make changes in that direction. What do you kind of see with that?
I will say this. I think the reason why that statistic really hasn't budged over the past 50, 60, 70 years is because we need to do more prevention work. We focus a lot on crisis intervention. We focus a lot on how to support the victim when they disclose. We don't spend a lot of time on teaching from a very early age what abuse is in a relationship, understanding what the emotional or the warning signs are before somebody becomes emotionally invested. If I'm going to be really honest, there is not a lot of work done on teaching how not to batter. And so if we know that oftentimes this is a learned behavior, children who grow up in violent homes learn that the way they problem solve is with their angry words or their fists, and nobody's coming in and teaching them different tools to change those behaviors, they're going to continue to perpetrate and have a 50% higher likelihood that they will or be victimized. We need to work on prevention. I mean, the reality is that we, as a Partnership for Change, that's what we do. We do prevention and awareness all over New Jersey. And it is amazing to us the amount of people that we speak to who respond with, I had no idea. I didn't even realize this was happening. So not only do we need to train people in regards to understanding what this issue is, but how to respond appropriately, how to support victims. It's funny, we spend a lot of time telling our young daughters, for example, how to be safe, what to do to keep themselves from being attacked or raped. And we spend, the discussion now is, well, we need to spend time telling young men and older men not to rape. It's the same thing in regards to domestic violence. We spend so much time on the empowerment of women, which should be happening, of course, but we don't spend a lot of time on modeling and teaching young men and women, because women can perpetrate as well, although it is more of a gender-based issue, teaching them what is autonomy in a relationship, what is true empowerment in a relationship, what power and control really does look like, understanding that jealousy and possessiveness are not healthy options in a relationship. Until that happens, and it happens earlier, or much earlier, we're going to continue to just put out fires. And that's, listen, that's where we're at. We're putting out fires, and we're taking batterers and we're throwing them in batterers programs, and we're not getting underneath that Band-Aid to educate them. And again, we're putting out fires. And just really quickly on the batterer piece of things, which is why I really firmly do believe nothing is changing, is there's not a program, a batterers intervention program in the country, and there's up to, I think, over 2,000 of them, that can actually track recidivism rates. So we actually don't know if these programs are working, and we can only go by the fact that 1 out of 4 women continuously are being abused in their relationship. It's not changing. So we know something on the other end is not working. We have to do things different. Got to start young before they're emotionally invested in these relationships to understand them.
Thanks, Allison. I appreciate that. It's a perfect segue to introduce Fraidy Reiss, who is the executive director of Unchained Last. So I'm going to start, she'll introduce herself more fully, but I just want to lead with, yes, there is child marriage in the United States. And no, it is not typically okay. The UN comes out against it. Everybody recognizes it. But in the United States, we have this mythology around child marriage that pictures these romantic Romeo and Juliet scenarios. Fraidy, is that accurate?
No. So, well, your first part is accurate that both forced marriage and child marriage remain significant problems in the United States. And it's because of lax laws that still unfortunately allow them and even encourage these abuses. And no, it's not okay. We love to think that America is special and wonderful, and maybe it is, but I have to 100% guarantee everyone here that a human rights abuse in the United States is as much a human rights abuse as anywhere around the world. So the way it works, unfortunately, in the United States, we have very few laws and policies in place that acknowledge forced marriage of adults. A forced marriage is one in which one or both parties do not give full free consent. And unlike other countries that have laws to prevent this and to punish this, we have almost none of that in the United States and almost no acknowledgement. And then on the child marriage front, a child marriage is one in which one or both parties is not yet age 18. It can easily be forced because minors who are not yet 18 have limited legal rights and therefore have a very difficult time if they don't want to get married and their parents or someone else is forcing them into a marriage. And shockingly, when we first started working on this at Unchained Last in 2015, child marriage was legal in all 50 US states and every territory and district and at the District of Columbia and at the federal level. We've been pushing for 6 years now. And so far, we have convinced 4 US states to end child marriage, but still child marriage or marriage before 18 remains legal in 46 US states. And we recently completed a study that showed that between 2000 and 2018, nearly 300,000 children were married in the United States. A few of them were as young as 10. Although most of them were age 16 or 17, where they still don't have the right typically to leave home if a marriage becomes abusive, to get into a domestic violence shelter, to retain an attorney because contracts with children are voidable, and because they're not allowed to bring a legal action in their own name, typically until the day they turn 18, still not even old enough in most states to file for divorce. So they can be hundreds of thousands of children who are entered into marriages by their parent and or a judge with little or no input from them, and then not even allowed to file for divorce. And one more really shocking statistic, there's so much I could share from the study we just finished, but I want to leave you with more than actually 60,000 marriages since 2000 occurred at an age or with a spousal age difference that should have been considered a sex crime.
Thanks, Fraidy. That is so powerful. And that's actually how we came across your work originally. I don't want to get into individual stories, but I think the most alarming thing that I read was some girl came forward and accused an uncle of sexual abuse. And instead of having charges filed, they had her marry him so that it was no longer actionable. So I know that that's probably a pretty extreme example, but that's what I think of when I think about the amazing work that you're doing, that you're helping people like that. So what we're going to do is you guys explain the problem. So you guys are all doing really innovative things to help address the issue and trying to decrease the not only decrease the prevalence, but kind of improve the way institutions are responding when this comes forward, not just providing support to victims, but also trying to change the structure that's creating new ones. So I'm going to hop back to you, Shira, if you would like to share kind of what you're doing specifically in religious organizations to have the response be different.
Sure. So it's actually, I can pick up off of what Allison said before. So this idea of with fire safety, we don't wait until there's a fire and then try to put it out. Anytime an institution opens, they have to be up to fire safety code. And you wouldn't think of having an institution open its doors if it's not that. There are protocols, there are procedures, there's training. Even the youngest children know when they walk into an institution what the fire safety protocol is. And so we see this as fairly straightforward and simple in a similar manner. you can't open your doors until you've thought about the basic safety rights of every single person who comes in, whether it's physical or virtual doors. And so that requires best practices in terms of policy and in terms of training. And so we do this. Our goal is really to standardize safety in Jewish institutions across the country. And so one example of this is our Aleinu Safeguarding Children campaign, where we've taken the national standards set by the CDC and we've broken it down into what does this look like in a Jewish youth serving organization, considering cultural factors. How does it play out and what do you need to think about? And then we give implementation tools. So instead of just telling you what to do, we show you how to do it, operating from the premise that most people want to prevent abuse. Most people don't want to be on the wrong side of this issue, but they don't have the tools to do so. And so we partner with the organizations rather than shaming them when something happens. We partner with them and help them to get the prevention in place. And similarly, on the adult end, we're in development of a policy toolkit called Kalim, which will work with Jewish workplaces or synagogues, wherever it may be, to help them put policies in place so that employees, so that staff, volunteers, board members, and guests, let's say it's a JCC or some other communal organization, knows exactly how to get help if somebody does do something to them, and that the community at large can hold them accountable. So it's not the secret thing that happens and you have to rely on the goodwill of a faith leader, but actually you've now publicized what your process and system is. And if you deviate from it, everybody knows and everybody can hold you accountable to your own policies. And to date, that hasn't really been the case. And so that's where we want to move everybody into standardizing what safety looks like so that institutions can come out as heroes, champions of safety, and really be the voice for victim survivors instead of finding themselves on opposite ends of this equation.
That's great, Shira. That makes sense. And kind of piggybacking on that, I think the issue, what you're describing is getting people involved who can do appropriate action. And that comes up again with the military, getting it out of the chain of command and getting the right people involved. So I'm going to go back to you, Deshauna. You talked about things that are being done to hold perpetrators accountable, having them not be moved around. What are you guys doing and advocating for in the military to protect victims?
Thank you for that question. Yeah, it's very similar to what Shira said, is where we're really, our focus is definitely on policy and legislation. The military is one of those organizations where you're going to have to go through the government, through the DOD, to be able to make actual cultural changes. And it's going to start with policy and regulations and things along those lines that really just create this concrete requirement. We can't just leave it up to leaders to be able to make their own changes within their own units. You have to have some sort of policy behind it. So we have research associates and fellows, and we have government relations analysts that work side by side as SWAN employees with congressmen and congresswomen that are implementing legislative change. As of right now, our focus is on the Military Justice Improvement Act. And this piece of policy is dedicated to requiring the military to remove all of the criminal justice requests and the investigation portions of like assaults and harassment and discrimination that take place at the unit level. We're going to remove those powers from the commanders and the leaders that are in place and put it in place of a third party organization that will come in and investigate. This does a few things. It creates this discretionary line where the unit doesn't necessarily have to know when they're being investigated or who is the person that is accusing someone else of assault, et cetera, because the third party that the soldier will go through and inform has no legal requirement to inform the unit of anything. So that one prevents retaliation from within the unit. So that's the first part. The second part is by requiring a third party to do the investigation and make the final determination of if any criminal charges will be pressed against one person or multitude of people. What that does is that removes implicit bias. I'm going on 11 years in the Army Reserve, and during my command time, there is a level of implicit bias that a lot of leaders and commanders have when you have someone that comes forward saying that this soldier did this. And in my mind as a commander, that's one of my best soldiers. How is this possible? So this level of bias that is in our minds really does transition into whether or not what type of actions we take towards them. And it really should not be up to us. One thing that I do notice about being a commander and being in leadership positions, we're not necessarily trained on being an investigator, being a lawyer, focusing on charges, the paperwork, all those things. We're not trained on that as commanders. We're trained on our branch, the actual requirements that we have for what we do for our jobs. Myself, I was petroleum detachment unit commander. So my focus was on gas, petroleum. It's on, making sure that we're able to be able to pass gas through a Humvee or through an aircraft and that it doesn't tear the engine up. That's what I was trained on. I wasn't trained on how to handle someone that's being accused of sexual assault. You all didn't train me on that. Therefore, it should not be within my capabilities to be able to determine who's right, who's wrong, where it went wrong, and whether or not this person should be charged. So that's SWAN's primary focus on prevention and what it is that we're doing. The secondary focus is on research. Oftentimes when it comes to the military, really any large scale organization is not going to make any change unless they think that they need to make a change, which means that they need data, they need historical data. So a lot of what we do as an organization is we come with the books, the pamphlets, the research, we come with all the facts. So a lot of our focus is on years and years and years of historical data and research that we use with our research fellows in our research teams and our research studies. So we have a few of those things going. Our focus is policy change and research.
Great. Thank you, Deshauna. I'm going to jump order a little bit and go to Fraidy because I think you guys have one of the most unique models in the way that you go to legislators. I remember seeing your stuff where you all are dressed up in your bridal gowns and you go with your mouths covered in tape and you advocate at the legislative level. So I'll have you speak to that, but also you do a lot of work with victims directly. And again, to that original point about what changes a victim into somebody who thrives after abuse is having people to support them, because so many of these victims are isolated and not getting support, and your organization meets that need as well. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Fraidy.
Yes, and thank you for that. So you're right. We attack the problem of forced and child marriage in the United States with a two-pronged approach. On the one hand, we provide direct services to individuals in the United States who are in or facing a forced marriage and need a little bit of support while they're getting out. I say a little bit of support, sometimes a lot more than that. I myself am a forced marriage survivor. That's why I founded Unchained Last. So I understand the trauma and the hopelessness that somebody in that situation is experiencing and feeling. And we provide really crucial, comprehensive wraparound services, often life-saving services, everything from helping an individual to escape from the bad situation, getting them someplace safe. Sometimes the escapes are international. We work on those with the US State Department. If someone was taken overseas for a forced marriage, get them back to the United States, get them someplace safe, and then all kinds of legal, social services, emotional support, financial support to help them also rebuild their lives. As getting out of a bad situation is not enough. You also need to rebuild your life. In many cases, like in my own, when your own family has turned on you and shunned you and considers you dead and you're starting on your own from scratch. And we never charge for any of our services, by the way, they're always for free. And then on the advocacy side, we are determined to stop this from happening. So we want to put ourselves out of business. And we do that where there's obviously a lot of legislation that's needed on the forced marriage side, the forced marriage of adults. But we started our advocacy work on the child marriage piece because when a girl, it's almost always a girl, 78% of the children who married recently in the United States were girls married to adult men. So it's almost always a girl. And then when they reach out to us to ask for the same help that we're providing to adults, we unfortunately have to tell them there's almost nothing that we can do. If we help a minor to escape from a forced marriage, in many states, we could be charged criminally for our part. They don't have the right to leave home. And as I was saying before, there's nowhere for them to go because they can't get into a shelter. They're so trapped. It's such an unfathomable, evil, nightmarish legal trap we have created for children, mostly girls, by allowing them to be entered into marriage before they have any of the rights that they need to navigate a contract as serious as marriage. And so we have been working state by state with legislators to urge them to introduce and pass simple, common sense legislation. I always say it's legislation that harms no one, it costs nothing, and it ends a human rights abuse. The US State Department considers marriage before 18 a human rights abuse. Just end marriage before 18. And it's shocking, though, that legislators in state after state have looked at this simple, common sense legislation that would save girls' lives and have said, no, thank you, pass. And what a lot of them have said again and again, they have told us, well, I'm just an old fashioned kind of guy. I just still believe that if a girl gets pregnant, she has no choice. She has to get married, even if she was raped. So we have been pushing back hard to convince legislators that, as I like to say, the Middle Ages called and they want their laws back. And it's time to end child marriage in the United States. So to raise awareness of this and convince legislators that girls do matter and they are more than just a womb, one of the things that we do is, as you said, Jennifer, we invented a chain-in. It's a form of protest where we gather in bridal gowns and veils, and we chain our wrists and we tape our mouths to show legislators, this is what you're doing to someone when you force them to marry. This is what life looks like. We've also written op-ed articles and I give a lot of media interviews. I did a TEDx talk. We're constantly doing this new study that we did on the extent of child marriage in the United States. Anything that we can do to raise awareness and get people to know. The biggest problem we have is that most Americans don't know that child marriage is still legal in 46 US states. When they know, they're horrified. What legislators need is to hear from their own constituents telling them, are you kidding me? Really? You're not going to end child marriage? And also, you haven't already done that?
Absolutely. We agree 100%. And it seems like a nice segue to go to Allison with Partnership for Change. You talk about kind of those ingrained beliefs, the romantic idea, that old-fashioned idea. Allison, you get to teens and you get to young people, explaining to them, hey, that might not be love. That might be something else. How do you negotiate that with them, and how do you educate people about some of the dangers that might just seem like love to them?
That's a great question. I will say this. What a Partnership for Change does is we train first responders, and first responders can be anyone. Right? It can be police, law enforcement, it could be healthcare, it could be schools, it's your next door neighbor if they're the ones being disclosed to. So what we know for sure is that anybody who comes in contact with anybody needs to understand this issue and needs to know how to respond effectively, because human nature, our knee-jerk response is, just get out of it. Just leave. Why don't you leave? Why don't you call the police and get out? And knowing what we know is that's the worst thing we could say to somebody who does not have a plan and is not in a situation where they can be safe. So what we do is we train the first responders throughout the state on what they need to know. We train the police on victim impact because police are first responders, and inevitably you go to the same house over and over again. Sometimes they become a little desensitized and less empathetic to the victim. We give them victim impact training so that they understand what victimization actually is. We train school social workers because we need them to understand that this is happening to 1 out of 3 teenage girls and 1 out of 7 teenage boys, and they need to know how to respond. So we help schools build policy to respond effectively. We have our Intimate Partner Violence Advocate Certification Series, which is a 5-class series to teach people the issue and become solid and good advocates. And those carry social work and LPC credits. In regards to the teens, we have this wonderful teen peer leadership program called Power Back. It's actually the most comprehensive teen dating abuse peer leadership program in the state. And this particular program, we commit to a 2-year interaction with the schools that we go into. This is a VOCA, I just want to say really quickly, it's a VOCA funded program. VOCA is now being hit with 33% cuts. So funding is very important to us right now to maintain this program. And what we do with the schools that we're in, and we get hired by separate schools, is we start every program off with a teen forum. So we speak to the girls and boys separate, wherever they identify as the forum they can go into. We would love to do more, but we would be in a school for, all day long. We can't do that. And I always take the teen girls and we do a very honest, a very gritty teen dating abuse 101. And to see the faces on these young girls when I do them, and that's probably over 12, we've spoken to over 18,000 students in the state so far. And to see the reaction when you tell them what, emotional abuse, verbal abuse, technological abuse, sexual abuse actually is, and physical abuse, there you can see the blood drain from their face because they are so disconnected from what true abuse in a relationship is. And that's what we're seeing with the teens. We have found that there's a direct correlation between the teens in these abusive relationships and what they're going home to. No matter what type of school district we're in, no matter what the socioeconomic or geographical area, always between 21 and 23% after the forums acknowledge they're going home to some level of domestic violence within their homes. But what we're trying to do is teach these young people early. I'm always going to say that. Prevention. Teach them early before they're emotionally invested, what they need to know and what they need to look for. And we do the same with the boys. We also talk to them about consent, and we also talk to them. We spend a significant and fair amount of time with sexual abuse. And just really quickly in regards to sexual abuse, especially with the teens, but absolutely with adults as well. When the young people are thinking sexual abuse, they're thinking of violent rape. They're thinking of someone putting a drug in their drink and raping them or taking advantage of them or assaulting them. What we try to explain and what is so important, coercion. If you are guilted, harassed, harangued, not somebody not bothering you constantly, begging, pleading, forcing you, physically like moving you to certain areas of their body. And these young women especially are consenting, thinking they're consenting. They're not actually consenting. They're saying yes in their mind, that is consent. That is not consent. And when we talk to the young girls, especially about that, that's what they line up to talk to me about at the end of the forums, because they're realizing coercion is not consent. That is not a yes. And that's happening every day, everywhere. And I think it's really important to note that. And that's part of the education we do with the teens.
That's great. Thank you. Shira said something when we spoke on one of our panels when we were kind of preparing for this. We think of abuse and absence of abuse as this binary system. And, what we lose in that conversation is prevention and education where you bring respect into it and teaching respect for one another. Shira, you mentioned that when we were talking. Can you expand on that? Because I think it's an important point to make here.
Sure. So I think we need to expand the idea of consent so that consent is not just about sexual activity, where of course it needs to live, but is there consent in all our interactions? Is there respect for another human being's agency? And that includes children. Children are their own bodies, their own people. They have their own needs and wishes and desires. And so do we respect that? Do we respect a child's right to bodily autonomy? Do we respect if we're in a workplace, do we pressure someone? Is there a discrepancy in power? And so in the way we relate to them, we abuse our power. It may be sexual, but it may be entirely other. And it starts from a place of really treating one another, that we are respecting each person's right to dignity. That doesn't mean that each person gets what they want, right? That doesn't mean a child gets to dictate all the terms of what happens. It doesn't even mean that a junior employee comes into work and says, this is what's happening today. But it does mean that every single interaction is one that is based in respect. And I think too often we can follow the media, and every day it seems there's another example of people who have tremendous power in all different kinds of industries, and they're using that power to abuse others who are subordinate to them. When we get into faith communities, we can see a manipulation of faith, a manipulation of theology, tremendous spiritual abuse and injuries, where a person is using the power that they have to treat another human being in a way that they matter less, simply put, and that they somehow exist to help that person to further their needs, maybe because they're a representative of God. And so this isn't about religion. This is about human nature and about the safeguards we have in place, but we see it in all communities. And I think it's very easy to talk about egregious harm and for all of us to say, you know, yes, we stand against child abuse. Yes, we stand against sexual assault. Yes, we stand against child marriage. But that's nice in theory. In practice, when we see it, we often don't recognize what's right in front of our eyes. And so a place that is full of disrespect is a place that has a foundation where abuse can take root. Because when it does, it's very hard to tell the difference between when you are slightly crossing the line to when it goes further and further and further. And people who are looking to abuse are going to use that to their advantage. And so if we have a climate where we are very clear on what respectful interactions look like, so we're not just saying what not to do, but we're saying what to do. And this becomes the premise of our moral culture in the organization, then when somebody crosses that line, it becomes very clear and we can all intervene immediately at the first signs.
Absolutely, that makes sense. Deshauna, when we met, I want to start by saying thank you for your service and what you do. You're an active service person, and I remember kind of joking with you, like, wow, you went in anyway. You knew all this, but it was so important for you to serve. It is a source of pride for you. It's your family served. It matters to you, and you want to be there, and you want to change this for the positive. So how do you see on that subtle level, do you see any of that culture shifting in the military? Do you see it being a more inclusive environment for women?
I do. I think that we are seeing a huge culture shift as of right now within the past year due to the tragic death of PFC Vanessa Guillen at Fort Hood last year. She really started this almost like military version of the Me Too movement in a way, because she started the I Am Vanessa Guillen Act, which is also a piece of policy that's similar to Military Justice Improvement Act. But for those that don't know, I'll just do a quick rundown. She was a young soldier being harassed by a soldier that was of higher rank, and she was too scared to come forward. So the harassment ended up turning into her being murdered, actually, on base. She was in the arms room, which is probably one of the safest places on a military base. The arms room is where all the weapons are. So she actually went into her office, which is where she worked. She was an arms sergeant. And she went into her office, and the same person that had been harassing her for however so long came in, and I don't know if he pushed himself on her or whatever the case may be, but he ended up killing her, murdering her, putting her into a large container box and dragging her body out of the arms room. And she went missing for about 2 months. And her family fought incredibly hard. The Latino community down near Fort Hood fought incredibly hard for the military to do more when it came to looking for her. And eventually they did an entire community search, and they found a body, which turned out to be someone else's body. That was another soldier that had gone missing a few months prior. They did more searching and then ended up finding Vanessa's body and figuring out kind of the entire backstory. And what ended up happening, which is why the I Am Vanessa Guillen movement kind of started, which was similar to the Me Too movement, was that a lot of female soldiers came forward with the hashtag I Am Vanessa Guillen by saying, I know exactly, what she went through when it came to being sexually harassed and having someone in a leadership position that I'm too scared to report. So it was a real huge shift. It was very, very much in the public eye. It was a lot of people that were very upset, because when we look at Vanessa Guillen, was this very young, beautiful, vibrant woman that had an entire life ahead of her. When we look at her, she looks like our sisters, our cousins, the person that we went to high school with. So I think a lot of people connected with her because she looks like somebody that could be a part of our communities. So I say all that to say that I think that it's unfortunate that it took a tragic death to get something like the Military Justice Improvement Act passed and all these other pieces of legislation. But I think that we have to be somewhat of a watchdog when it comes to the military, and really being able to hold them accountable and saying, well, why isn't this at the forefront of the conversation? And why was Vanessa Guillen missing for 2 months and y'all didn't go looking for her? What happened? So cultural change is happening in a nutshell. It's unfortunate that it takes someone passing in the manner in which she did to implement cultural change. But one thing I want to say when it comes to women that join the military, we are taking a risk at joining the military. But like you said, it's one of those things, especially for me, I come from a lineage of service members, from my grandma to my dad, my mother, my sister, my brother, and myself. So it is somewhat of a tradition and a pride thing. It's something where I don't want to say I don't want to join the military because I'm afraid of being assaulted or harassed. I don't want that to be my prevention method. I want to join and hope that I'm walking into a military that's better today than it was yesterday. And I think that that's what I love most about SWAN, is that I feel like I'm making it better for women to come. So, the logic itself is probably a little bit unique, but, I think for myself, patriotism and serving this country is something that I believe to be very important. And we have to, when we look at women, especially when we look at women service members, oftentimes they see us as, G.I. Jane, Demi Moore, and they think we're just the toughest things ever, but, we're still human, and, we need assistance, we need help. And when we are suffering or we're going through something, we're not going into G.I. Jane mode, we're experiencing traumas, and we can't look. And I think that's the one thing, and I'll say this quickly and cut myself off because I'll go on a tangent. But one thing I find when it comes to suffering or trauma from soldiers is that people see us as a soldier. They see us as a trooper, a tough person, but we're still human. And when we face traumas and we face experiences that really do, cause post-traumatic stress disorder and all these other mental disorders. So it is important that when we see soldiers, we still see them as human, as people that still have their own moments where they need assistance, and we need policy change, and we need to make sure that we are creating safe spaces for women like myself to be able to serve this country without fear of assault or harassment or discrimination. So,
absolutely. Thank you. Speaking to consequences as a way to have some prevention around these issues. Laws are different by state, but Allison, one of the things that I was reading, if I commit an assault in a certain state, I could face more time and it would be a felony. But if I assault my spouse, it could be a misdemeanor. That's not true across the board, but there are some states that fall into that. Do you think that regulating consequences is a way to get more traction on decreasing the frequency of domestic violence?
Oh, there's no question about it. I think our biggest issue within the court systems is that they don't take into consideration the longevity of abuse somebody can suffer in regards to when they finally disclose that it's happening and report. So, for example, in the state of New Jersey, although not a misdemeanor, if my partner punches me in the face and breaks my nose, that person will be arrested and will go in front of a municipal judge because that's a simple assault. So depending on the level of assault, they go to the municipal judge or they go to the county judge. The problem is we have something called pretrial intervention in New Jersey, and originally designed for low crime first-time offenders. But what happens to the victim and the perpetrator when I've been battered for a series of years and I finally have the strength to report and call the police, and now I'm in front of a judge and they're looking at a file that says, well, they've never been arrested before, they have no record, and this is the first time. And so we're going to give you a slap on the wrist, tell you to go to those batterers programs and send you on your way. And what message does the law send the perpetrator and the victim? So we have to work to change these laws. This is not acceptable. We have to learn and understand that there's more of a history involved almost always, and that it's rare that it's somebody in a committed relationship or in a relationship in general that gets hit on the first date or the first interaction and then immediately calls the police. So there needs to be more taken into consideration. We have to work harder. There must be stronger consequences. There must be a stronger message to perpetrators saying that this is intolerable and we will not allow this to continue. And to continuously have these laws. And listen, our biggest hurdle, honestly, is training judges. There are prosecutors who get it. There are attorneys who do not get it. They oftentimes will have a victim barter with their restraining order for a divorce settlement. You don't barter with someone's safety. And so we have a lot of work ahead of us in regards to changing the laws and helping support victims who are finally, coming forward. And although in the eyes of the law, it's the first time they're coming forward, but that they can prove that it's been happening over the course of time. So we need to go further. I will also say in the state of New Jersey, unless you are legally emancipated, are in the military, or have a child in common with your batterer, if you're under the age of 18, you can't get a restraining order, and your parents can't get one on your behalf either. And so that's an issue. So part of our teen program is we have kids sign petitions that we send to our state legislature to let them know that's unacceptable. We have to keep teens safe, because right now, if I'm 16 and my partner is 16 and they physically assault me, they're going to be, I'll call the police, they'll be brought to the department, and their parents will pick them up and bring them home. And that's the basic gist of what's going to happen. So we need to work harder to have stronger and more stringent consequences for those that batter.
Absolutely. To that end, Fraidy, we have people on the call who are from all over the country. We put in the chat what states that is illegal for child marriage. But for the people who are in the states that is not the case, what can people do to help create policy change? How do people get involved? How can people tell their legislator on all the things that we're talking about today? There is legislation in every state about every single one of these topics. How can people get involved on a policy level?
Well, specifically about child marriage, if you go to unchainedlast.org, we have some simple and immediate actions that people can take to help end child marriage in their own state. If you're the 4 states that have ended child marriage so far are Delaware, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Minnesota. And by the way, today, what time is it? It's 2:55 Eastern time. So in a little over an hour, the Rhode Island legislature is going to vote. The lower house is going to vote to end child marriage, and the governor is expected to sign that bill. So we might soon have a 5th state. But if you're in the vast majority of the United States that does not have legislation yet banning child marriage, we do have legislation that's pending in 11 states. And if you go to Unchained Last, we have a list of the states, and in those states, you can submit an email to your legislators right now, letting them know, hello, I want you to end child marriage. If you want to remain in office, I put you there, and we're going to remove you unless you end child marriage. You can also just things as simple as following us and sharing, retweeting, liking on social media, just to raise awareness and build grassroots support. And then we have events. We have an event coming up, a webinar on June 17, that it's a national webinar we moderated by Chelsea Clinton to talk about the findings of our recent study on the extent of child marriage in the United States. Join our events. If your bridal gown is sitting in your closet and you don't know what to do with it, donate it to us so we can use it at a future chain-in. And please join us at a future chain-in. Let's all chain in together and tell legislators 18, no exceptions. It's time to end child marriage.
That's great, Fraidy. If all of the panelists could drop their website into the chat so people can get in touch with them. I think everybody probably has some suggestions on some action steps people can take. So if people could drop the website so people can find you, that would be great. It's almost 3 o'clock. So what we're going to do is we're going to wrap up officially, but we're going to go into the Q&A. So I want to thank you guys all so much for your time and for your expertise, your passion about this issue. Talking about it matters. Everything you're doing is definitely moving the needle. So thank you all for the amazing things you're doing. And so I'm going to jump to some of the questions from the audience. The first question that came in that I want to talk about is, we had a woman who wanted to ask Allison specifically. She works at a rape crisis center, and she wanted to know how you kind of address some of the defensiveness of the police or some of the other people that you're trying to educate about these topics to, because she said she's kind of confronted some defensiveness when trying to breach the topics.
The biggest piece of advice I can give you is to start small. When my fellow co-founder, Gloria Scrizzi, and I developed a partnership for change and realized we got to do something regarding the police, what we did was we actually approached about 10 chiefs in Union County, New Jersey. And we said, we're going to put a little meeting together, and we were hoping you would come on domestic violence and response. And they came, which was shocking in and of itself. And we sat with them and said, listen, we're not going to charge anything. We want to do this. We want to roll this out and provide some victim impact trainings for your officers. Will you send 10 people? And collectively they said, yeah, sure, we'll do that. Because up until then, they had only been doing technical training for officers. Officers in our state are required to do 4 hours a year of domestic violence training. They were looking at a website, or they were watching a webinar, a video. So they sent these officers, and we trained over the course of a year, 300 officers. We kept it very small. We did not push it. We took baby steps. We said, this is an opportunity for you to learn something about victim impact. They showed up. It was very well received. Since then, we've trained well over 3,000 officers. And so it by word of mouth and our marketing and our getting out there, this is really, with the police specifically, this is about developing relationships with the departments. And so we are 100% grassroots. We get our butts out there, and we knock on the doors of the departments, and we introduce ourselves, and we talk about the program and what we do. And they say, okay, we'll send officers. And that's how we've done it. And through the course of this period of time, it's gained a lot of momentum.
That's great. Thank you, Allison. This question is kind of a general question. It's a tough one. It's about when children who are abused come forward, and the reluctance to a lot of the courts to put children on the stand leads to justice not really being realized for a lot of child victims. I want to say something about this before I throw it out to the panel. We talked about this at the last town hall we have, because this is an ongoing frustration. These things always come up in the chats because the response in the courts, both the family and the criminal, is absolutely abysmal. And it's not unique to one state. You hear that repetitively, that this is a major barrier. One of our grantees, Tashmika Torek from Firecracker Foundation, said, a lot of times with the courts and juvenile cases, it's really not about justice. The courts don't always get you justice, but to remember that by even bringing it forward, you are interrupting the abuse. And sometimes interrupting the abuse is the best case scenario in terms of outcome. So I want to just say that was one of the things that we learned on the last call, and I wanted to share because it was very meaningful for me to hear. But I'll throw it out to the group. Does anybody have any thing that they can say in terms of the courts handling, and is that a barrier, or are there ways around it?
I could speak to this a bit, in that we often hear from organizations, well, we reported this to the authorities and the case was closed, or it didn't move forward, so there's nothing else we can do, right? We're done here. And reporting to the authorities is the minimum requirement, right? If an organization, if you're talking about child cases, if an organization is a mandated reporter, then they have to report. But now that the criminal justice system or the civil authorities are not moving forward, the question comes back to the organization. What will you do? What can you do? And there are a range of things that an organization can do. So they can conduct an internal investigation, hire outside investigators to do that. They could check in and make sure that they are supporting any victim or survivors in that case. They can, and even if they feel it's an unproven case, they don't know, they could still support the people involved. They can make sure that there are safeguards in place in their institution. So whatever situational factors were at play in that particular case, address them. What's the policy around it? What's the training? And also do a broader audit. So is there more of this going on that you just don't know about? And we may get a case where we start to see that there are interaction guidelines. Maybe there are staff who are emailing students in a way that's really concerning. Maybe there are other things happening. So let's look at this more holistically. And I'd say we can have some courage in directly confronting this. So faith leaders have a particular role to play here. Instead of just offering pastoral support to the victim, they could also demand accountability from an individual who is offending. We had a rabbi who came to us and said, there's someone in my community who has, he abused his wife. He admits that he abused his wife, and he wants to pray in our synagogue. Don't we believe in repentance? He has repented. This happened a very long time ago. And the answer is, well, of course we believe in repentance, but there are 10 other synagogues in your area that this person can pray at. And his wife attends your synagogue, and she is telling you that she is scared every single time she sees him. So we can both believe in repentance and support his healthy, pro-social, adaptive behavior going forward, while at the same time standing with this woman who is your congregant and saying, this is not the synagogue you need to pray at right now. Go find another synagogue. And so there are many ways that we can demand accountability, and we can do this of the individuals in our community. And if we have a position of power we're head of an organization, or even just work at an organization, we can demand this, and parents can demand this of their institutions and say, I understand that the criminal justice system closed this case. What are we doing about it? Because that's when we start to see people reoffending. That's when we see people placed back in the same positions with the same access, the same power. And that's when something that was really awful starts to become a tragedy that then can last for generations. And then later, there may be legal ramifications for that organization. So don't wait until you're compelled to do something because the law is forcing you. Do it because it's the right thing to do, the moral thing to do.
And just to piggyback off of that, I think it's important in regards to the child, testifying and the outcome of what's going to happen. In New Jersey, we are chock full of wonderful social service agencies that are designed to work with the child specifically, who are not aware or do not have the right kind of training insofar as understanding the impact domestic violence or the exposure to it has on a child. And these are also people who make the recommendations to the courts as to what's going to happen. And it is paramount that these agencies, and I'm not just talking child protective services, agencies that work as foster, agencies that work as support systems, supervised visitation, the whole 9 yards, they have to be able to weigh in and have a voice within the court system so that the children are getting the right type of supports. Many of these children are going for services and are being treated by therapists, private therapists, who don't understand the dynamic of domestic violence. They're doing more harm than good. So recommendations to the courts weigh heavily on decision-making. If we're going to prepare a child to testify, which is really the last thing I know that they would like to do, they need solid advocates to really spend the time in the most empathetic way possible to work with these kids, to ready them and prepare them age appropriately for getting in front of a jury and or a court and the judge and to explain and express their story. This all goes back to training at the end of the day. That's what it's all about. People need to really understand the dynamics of this issue if they're going to support victimization the right way.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you so much for your time, for your candidness. I know you guys are doing amazing things. Proud to know all of you. Thank you for dropping your information in the chat. And again, Barry Siegel, Focus for Health. We're proud to work with you. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us. Thanks for the work you do.
Take care.